The cameras were live when Jimmy Fallon asked, "Are the rumors about your vocal cords true?" And Neil Diamond touched his throat and admitted to the entire studio that he would never get his voice back. It was March 2018. Neil Diamond walked onto that stage to thunderous applause, the kind reserved for legends. 77 years old, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing his signature understated elegance. The audience rose to their feet before he even reached the chair. Jimmy greeted him with genuine warmth. They'd done this before, several times over the years. Neil was always a gracious guest, funny, self-deprecating, willing to play along with whatever sketch or game Jimmy had planned. But tonight felt different. Jimmy noticed it immediately. The way Neil sat down carefully, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way his hand kept drifting to his throat, a small, unconscious gesture that most people wouldn't catch. They started with safe questions. The new album. The upcoming tour dates. Neil answered smoothly, his speaking voice still strong and warm, that familiar rasp that had narrated a generation's soundtrack. "You're heading out on tour next month," Jimmy said, glancing at his notes. 50 cities. That's ambitious for... He caught himself, grinned. "For anyone, really?" Neil smiled. "Well, you know what they say. Keep moving or rust." The audience laughed. Everything seemed normal. But Jimmy had done his homework. He'd heard whispers in the industry. Cancelled recording sessions. A raspy quality to Neil's recent performances that went beyond his usual gravelly tone. Something about doctor's appointments, specialists, tests. He looked down at his blue cards. The next question wasn't on them. His producers hadn't approved it. But Jimmy Fallon had built his career on genuine connection, on asking the questions that mattered, on caring about the people sitting across from him. He put the cards down. "Neil," Jimmy said, his voice dropping its performative energy, becoming quieter, more serious. "Can I ask you something real?" Neil's smile faltered slightly. "Sure, Jimmy. There have been rumors. About your voice. About your vocal cords." Jimmy leaned forward. "Are they true?" The studio went silent. Neil Diamond sat very still. His hand moved to his throat again, this time deliberately. For 5 full seconds, an eternity on live television, he didn't speak. The roots stopped their subtle background rhythm. Questlove's face appeared on camera, concerned. The audience held its collective breath. "Yes," Neil finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're true." Jimmy waited, giving him space. The silence stretched. "Can you tell us more?" Neil looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, a small shake he tried to hide by clasping them together. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he said, "The tour I just announced? I had to cancel it. All 50 cities." A sound rippled through the audience. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob. Something in between. "I can't give people what they deserve," Neil continued, his voice steady but strained. "I can't hit the notes anymore. Sweet Caroline, Cracklin' Rosie, America, all the songs people love, I can't sing them the way they should be sung." Jimmy's eyes were glistening. "When did you know?" Neil's jaw tightened. He looked like he was deciding something, weighing whether to keep the wall up or let it crumble. "There was a concert. January 27th, Australia. Brisbane Entertainment Centre." He paused, gathering himself. "I remember standing backstage before the show. I'd been on tour for 3 months already and something felt off that night. My hands were shaking more than usual. I kept dropping things, my water bottle, my reading glasses. My tour manager asked if I was okay and I told him I was just tired." Neil's voice dropped lower, more intimate, like he was pulling the audience into that moment with him. "But I knew something was wrong. You know your own body. You know when things aren't right. I just didn't want to admit it yet. So I walked out onto that stage anyway." The audience was completely silent now, every person leaning forward. "I was in the middle of September Morn. Beautiful song, I've sung it thousands of times. There's this note in the bridge. Not even a particularly difficult note, just a sustained G that carries the emotion. I opened my mouth to hit it, and he stopped, his hand going to his throat. Nothing. My vocal cords just froze. It was like someone had reached inside and switched them off. Neil's eyes were distant now, seeing that stage again. I stood there with the microphone in my hand, trying to make sound, any sound. The band kept playing behind me, waiting for me to come back in. 10,000 people watching. The stage lights so bright I couldn't see individual faces, just this sea of people all staring, all waiting. And I had nothing to give them. He demonstrated with his hands, bringing them together like something closing. My throat closed up. My hands started shaking so badly I could barely hold the microphone. For maybe 15 seconds, felt like 15 hours, there was just the band playing and me standing there silent. The audience was crying now. Jimmy's face showed the weight of what he was hearing. I finished the show, Neil said quietly. I don't know how. Adrenaline, maybe. Stubbornness. I faked my way through the rest of the notes, stayed in a lower register, let the audience sing more than I did. When I walked off that stage, my tour manager was waiting in the wings. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both knew. Neil wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I went back to my dressing room and I sat there for 2 hours. Didn't change out of my stage clothes. Didn't turn on the lights. Just sat there in the dark knowing that everything had changed. That's when I knew. I'd never sing professionally again. The words landed like a physical blow. People in the studio were crying now. Not just audience members, crew members, cameramen, producers in the control room. Everyone who understood something precious was being lost. The hardest part, Neil said quietly, isn't losing my career. I've had 50 years. I've been blessed beyond measure. The hardest part is knowing that the last time I sang Sweet Caroline in front of an audience, I didn't know it was the last time. If I'd known, I would have paid more attention. I would have remembered every single second. But still, the question remained unanswered. What took his voice? Jimmy could see it in the audience's faces, in the way they waited. Cancer? An injury? Surgery gone wrong? Neil's hand went to his throat again. The tremor in his fingers more visible now. He took a deep breath. When was the diagnosis? Jimmy asked gently. Last year, Neil said. I'd been noticing things for a while before that. The shaking in my hands. The stiffness. The way my voice would catch on certain notes. I thought it was just age. 77 years, you know, things wear out. He looked directly at the camera, as if speaking to every person watching at home. But then the doctors ran tests. MRIs, blood work, neurological exams. And they sat me down and gave me the results. The studio held its breath. It's called Parkinson's disease, Neil said quietly. And one of the things it does, one of the many things it takes, is precise motor control. Including the muscles that control your vocal cords. The collective gasp was audible this time. Parkinson's. The word hung in the air like a verdict. That's why my hands shake, Neil continued, holding them up so everyone could see the tremor. That's why my voice gave out on that stage in Australia. That's why I'll never sing Sweet Caroline again. Because Parkinson's doesn't ask permission. It just takes. Jimmy stood up from his chair and moved around the desk, something he rarely did during serious interviews. He sat on the edge of his desk, closer to Neil, his face full of compassion. I'm so sorry, Jimmy said, his voice thick. Neil nodded, accepting it. Then something shifted in his expression. Can I tell you why this hurts so much, Jimmy? It's not about the fame or the applause. It's something else. Something I've never talked about publicly. Please, Jimmy said. What Jimmy didn't know, what the audience didn't know, was that Neil Diamond had driven to NBC studios that day with a letter in his jacket pocket. A letter he'd written 3 days earlier but hadn't decided whether to actually give to anyone. The letter contained the real reason Neil Diamond became a songwriter. Not the version he told in interviews for 50 years. The real one. I was 8 years old. Neil began, his voice steadier now, finding strength in the story. Brooklyn. My parents were going through a really rough time, financially, emotionally, everything was falling apart. I'd hear them fighting at night through the walls of our tiny apartment. And I was terrified. Terrified they'd split up, terrified we'd lose our home, terrified of everything an 8-year-old can't control. The audience was completely absorbed. Even the camera operators had stopped adjusting their equipment. There was this man who lived in the apartment below us. Mr. Greenberg. Old Jewish man, must have been 70. He played violin. Not professionally, just for himself. And one night, when my parents were fighting particularly loud, I heard him start playing. Through the floor. This beautiful, sad melody. And I stopped crying. I just listened. Neil's hands were shaking slightly as he continued, but he didn't try to hide it anymore. I went downstairs in my pajamas and knocked on his door. He opened it, saw this scared little kid, and he didn't say a word. Just stepped aside and let me in. He played violin for me for 2 hours that night. Didn't talk about my parents, didn't ask questions. Just played. And for those 2 hours I felt safe. Jimmy was completely still, tears running down his face. He did that for me twice a week for the next 3 years. Every time things got bad upstairs, I'd knock on his door and he'd play. And that's when I understood what music could do. It couldn't fix my parents' marriage. It couldn't solve their money problems. But it could create a space where I could breathe. Where I could remember that beauty still existed even when everything felt like it was falling apart. Neil reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The letter. He held it for a moment, then handed it to Jimmy. Mr. Greenberg died when I was 11. Heart attack. Sudden. I never got to thank him properly, never got to tell him what those nights meant to me. And I promised myself, standing at his funeral in a too-big suit I'd borrowed from my cousin. I promised myself that if I ever had the ability to create that safe space for someone else, I would. Every single time I could. Jimmy took the letter with trembling hands but didn't read it. He just held it. That's what's in there, Neil said, his voice breaking. The real reason I became a songwriter. Not because I wanted to be famous. Not because I loved performing. Because I wanted to be Mr. Greenberg for someone else. Every song I've ever written is trying to create that same space he created for me. The studio erupted in applause. Not excited applause, something deeper. Acknowledgement. Love. Collective grief. And now, Neil continued, tears streaming freely, now Parkinson's took my instrument. I can't create that space for people anymore. And that's what I'm actually losing, Jimmy. Not my career. My ability to be Mr. Greenberg for someone else. Jimmy set the letter down gently on his desk and reached for Neil's shaking hands. Can I tell you something? Of course. You just did it. Right now. In this moment. You created that space. Not with singing, but with truth. You let all of us, everyone in this room, everyone watching, you let us into your pain, and somehow that made us feel less alone with ours. That's exactly what Mr. Greenberg did for you. Neil's face crumpled. He covered his mouth with his hand, nodding, unable to speak. The instrument isn't your vocal cords, Jimmy said, his voice strong and clear. It never was. The instrument is your heart. Your honesty. Your willingness to show up and be real. And Parkinson's can't take that from you. The audience rose as one. Standing ovation. Not for a performance, but for courage. For vulnerability. For a man showing the world what grace looks like when everything is falling apart. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Because stories like this deserve to be heard. Neil wiped his eyes, smiled through his tears, and reached into his pocket one more time. He pulled out a small, battered harmonica. Mr. Greenberg gave me this the last time I saw him. Neil said, holding it up so the cameras could see. I've carried it for 66 years. Never learned to play it. Never felt worthy of it. He looked at Jimmy. But maybe it's time. His hands were shaking badly from the Parkinson's as he lifted the harmonica to his lips. The first note came out wavering, uncertain. The second barely made a sound. The third was stronger, clearer, beautiful in its imperfection. 3 notes. Not a melody. Just 3 simple notes played by trembling hands and a breaking heart. The audience exploded. Cheering, crying, celebrating not the music but the courage it took to make it. Jimmy stood beside Neil with tears streaming down his face, and together they showed the world what vulnerability looks like. 2 years later, Neil Diamond sat in the audience at the Kennedy Center Honors. He couldn't perform, but when the tribute band played Sweet Caroline, every single person in that theater sang, loudly, imperfectly, joyfully. Neil's hand went to his throat, tears on his face, and he finally understood what Jimmy had tried to tell him that night. The instrument was never his vocal cords. It was always his heart. And that could never be silenced.